Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. My name is Uzair, and if you've been a regular listener of this podcast, you probably heard me talk time and again about the fact that Pakistan does not have a micropayments gateway, digital payments is still behind the curve, and the fact that Pakistan had digital ID and an identity management system long before countries like India, and that it was trailing was something that that needs to be changed. And now it has changed. We have Raast, a micropayments gateway. And to talk about Raast, I have with me Rehan Akhtar Saab, who's the Chief Digital Officer of Karandaaz. Karandaaz has played a key role in making all of this possible. So Rehan Saab, first of all, thank you for joining us today, and congratulations to you and the team and everyone who's worked both inside and outside the government to make this possible.
Thank you, Uzair, for having me on this podcast and extending the voice to your listeners. I think not only congratulations to us, but I think there are a lot of other players, who have been involved in this key infrastructure development. Yeah, so looking forward to to scaling up this infrastructure and really reaping up the benefits from this.
So let's start with Raast itself and what is the mission and vision of this micropayments gateway? Obviously, it's just kicking off, so its scaling up will take time. Its use cases being developed will take time. So help the audience understand first up what the vision is, and also who all played a role in terms of making this possible.
Hmm. So I'll start with the fact that what does Raast actually mean? The word, and uh, and while the infrastructure project has been going on for some time, but for last few months, there was a discussion that what should we call this effort, and I think the overwhelming view was that we need to have a name which is common, which is for the people, but it also kind of gives a direction in the name. There are a lot of other gateways which have pay in it, which have paisa in it, depending on the Pakistani context. And State Bank also wanted to differentiate, this effort or this uh, system from other sort of systems and services. So Rast is one word, Rast. It means Brahe Rast, which is direct. It means Rahe Rast, which means the right way. So there's a hidden message in this word, and we hope as the adoption of this platform takes place, people also realize that while adopting digital payments, they're actually choosing a direct way. So hence Brahe Rast, and they're doing the right thing because, as you know, in Pakistan there's a huge informal market and huge informal economy, and cash is the king. So to dethrone that king, we have to have now a model, which is digital and which is direct and which is the right way to use. So and we hope that वो कहते हैं ना कि बच्चे का नाम जो है सही रखें तो फिर उसका character भी ठीक होता है. So we hope that this name will also be a guiding principle for the system in time and years to come.
And I think like also the fact that you said it's the right way. I think the users and the population of Pakistan also understands that there's a right way of doing transactions in your country as you as a citizen, where you try to formalize payments and make sure you don't do transactions that evade taxes, etc. And this will make all of this possible.
Definitely. I think that's where this system, when it was when we were nearing the stage of launch, and there were discussions with, for example, the government, the current government, and they kind of picked this up that this system will not only digitize the payments and do financial inclusion, but it will be the right way, and documentation will also sort of be facilitated, or documented economy will also be facilitated. So technically, you see, Pakistan is a fragmented market. You had this key question that while other countries uh, did not have the ID Pakistan had the ID, NADRA ID for a very long time. And why has it taken us so long to come where we are? So I think each market has its own dynamics and its own sort of phases of growth. And a market like financial services, this is what we have seen in other countries and other markets as well. You need to intervene. That could be a private sector intervention as well, or it could be a mix, or it could be a public sector intervention, just like Raast as well. You need to intervene to unlock potential. Because if you see the banks currently, the model that they have, they can actually exclude customers. And now I'm not being specific, but being generic. So hopefully I'm not stepping on some specific banks who may disagree with me. But in general, banks actually make money by excluding customers. So they say no to customers, and still, they have very, very blue bottom lines. And if you have that kind of an industry, how do you motivate the industry to start covering the excluded? And on top of it, as citizens, we love cash, we like informality, we hate documentation, we don't want to pay taxes. So this, both of these coupled together is the big problem. So while Pakistan had the ID, I think what Pakistan had missed or has been missing on is a drive to open accounts. So we see that in 2005 and 6, with branchless banking license being provided, there were 2, 3 players who started operations. There were actually more than 5 or 7, if I believe the number is correct, banks who actually got the license, but there were only 3 or 4 who actually set up operations and then took it to some kind of scale. And after 10 years or 12 years now, what we see is that there are only 2 players, EasyPaisa and JazzCash, who are still operating their wallet at a sizable manner, and also the agent network, which is very important for mobile money. But even with that kind of intervention, if you look at the demand side surveys, we only have 21% financial inclusion, which basically means that if you survey a common citizen in a national representative survey, 21% of them say we have an account with any of the institution. While on the supply side, if you see, there have been more than 50 million accounts that have been opened. Many are dormant. We're not counting unique accounts here. So I would rely on the demand side survey that, the market has not been able to provide the required coverage. So that's one big gap. In some of the other countries, that gap had been minimized even before digital payments actually took over. And that has been minimized by driving government agenda, central banks putting in targets for the banks to open up X number of accounts and Y village and, et cetera, et cetera. So in Pakistan, because it's a private sector led market predominantly, in fact, I think there's only one large national bank, which is government-owned bank, but otherwise it's all private sector mostly. So they chose to exclude citizens, and they're still making a lot of money, and that's why there was an intervention which was required to drive real interoperability in Pakistan. I mean, I would like to believe that EasyPaisa, JazzCash, and other innovators like Habib Bank, UPL, they have done their bit. But again, if you want to cover 80% of the market, which is left out there, you need new business models. You need new layers of innovation. या तो फिर ऐसा होता कि just like in China, there's one big player, WeChat, and that becomes the pseudo, incumbent super app, and everybody has WeChat, and you don't need interoperability per se. But in a country like Pakistan, where now the market shares are divided, you need real interoperability so that when the value proposition of DFS is provided to customers, it's provided in a simple, in a user-friendly manner, and they don't have to struggle with learning each app. They don't have to struggle with learning how do I transfer money in one app versus how do I transfer money in another app, et cetera, et cetera. It should be just like dialing a number. You dial a number in the same method regardless of what phone you have and what network you are in and what SIM you're using. So payments experience should also be universal in a way that it should give same
Well,
experience.
I think that that's a very important point, right? Like the key has to be, can your grandmother use this the same
Yeah.
way that she goes to buy her ration or send someone to buy a ration? If she can adopt this with minimal training or minimal issues, then it's a
Hmm.
successful mechanism, right? But I think a couple of things you mentioned that I want to touch upon and dive deeper into. The first one, that we hate documentation. I agree. And there is this idea that Pakistanis generally, I would say it's not just a Pakistani thing, it's anywhere. If you put onerous requirements on compliance, on documenting things, people will not want to do it because it takes away from their time. It's inconvenient. What is your view on why do Pakistanis in general hate documentation? Is this what I just said, that the onerous requirements of documentation are such that people shy away from this, or is this something uniquely Pakistani?
I would divide this issue into three parts. One is people who don't want to get documented, and let's keep them out of the discussion because they have other motivation. The second one is people who find it lengthy and difficult to use documentation or fill in documentation, and that is the reason why they do not come into the formal fold. I think that's a large population, and the example of that is that they, for example, people need credit or access to credit. It's just that the informal method, you walk into somebody who gives you an informal credit. It could be your family, it could be a friend, or a loan shark, or whoever sort of you have access to. And you go there, and I think it's a 3-minute discussion, and you get a credit, and maybe you walk away with cash at that moment as well. And if you compare to the bank, you need to submit documentation, even if for a credit that does not require collateral. Um, the decision-making process takes time, and it could be a number of days before your credit application is actually fulfilled. And that's where I think the informal sector beats the formal sector hands-on, in speed, in recognizing the customer. They're also taking, the same kind of risk that the formal sector could be taking, but the process is very, very sort of seamless. The third category of documentation is that while the documentation itself may not be that big, but if I need to, for example, if I'm registered in one bank and I walk into another bank, I need to start the process from scratch. So there is no interoperability of information. Actually, what should happen is, and many countries have, what they have done is that if I register once, and my KYC has been done, that KYC should be shared, so that the burden, even if it was a one-time burden, I go through it. But then the next time I want to become a customer for another bank, my credentials should be transferred, and that would also ease. And I think some European countries, and I think UK has done that, and some of the other countries are also trying to follow that model. So I think it's then how the information is set up, and do the banks really believe that should they open up the information for others to share? And the whole philosophical question that who does the information belong to? So it's my information, does it belong to me? Or is it actually, when I've given to the bank, now it belongs to the bank and he's the custodian, and will share whoever he, I'm calling the bank he, the bank would sort of, want to share. The same issue with telcos. Once you share the data, who does the data belong to? And I think in the modern sort of times, for the benefit of the country, for the benefit of economy, I think there has to be some kind of sharing of information across, companies as well as cross industries. That would only benefit sort of everyone. Of course, what we don't want to land up is a model like Facebook, and of course, where we
Or
have a
I
big
would
brother.
say in the financial system, a model like Ant Financial, right? We all know Jack Ma's run into trouble in China. One
Mm,
of the
mm,
causes driving this is the fact that his company has amassed a lot of data about Chinese citizens and their financial
mm,
transactions, has
mm.
very deep understanding of their credit history and their risk profile, but it's not public, which gives the Ant Financial a monopolistic power in the financial services industry. And there are other reasons why he's run into trouble, but one of the public, the public stance to the government is that this is too much power and we want to have a dynamic and competitive marketplace, and should put this information in a public repository so that if Uzair, who's been an Ant Financial customer, wants to go to the next big thing, his credit history should transfer over, and that other innovative business should have a level playing field, right? I think that's what you're getting at as well.
Yeah. So I wish we reached that stage,
Yes.
at least in terms of market coverage, that we have one big sort of super player who covers all of the market. But we need centralization of data, and lack of centralization also leads to burden on the citizen. So even CNIC, we have to submit our CNIC so many times to so many different places. I think for last few years now, what has started to happen is the use of biometric, verification, which is then connected with NADRA, and the ease that started to come with it. And I think so that's where the whole design or bad design comes into play. That it's not the citizen who does not want to get documented, but you create so many hurdles in his way or her way that you kind of defeat the motivation and you kind of give up, and you want to minimize your interaction with such institutions. So I think that's at least my take on documentation. The documentation could also be gradual. You
Yeah.
see, the KYC could also be gradual, and we have that progressive KYC model in banking as well, where you can start with a minimum KYC, and you can build on it. And as your risk sort of increases, your KYC should also, the depth, the knowledge that the institution should have about you, that would also increase. But right now, I think the discussion going on is, and you must have noticed that the Russian digital account, which is an account which people like yourself outside Pakistan could open in a Pakistani bank and enjoy a lot of benefits. So a remote KYC is allowed. So now the discussion has been triggered that ये special treatment जो है वो ज़ाहिर और अन्य जैसे लोगों के लिए क्यों है? And there are a lot of people in Pakistan who believe that if this option is provided, a remote KYC is provided, they would like to avail and not get into lines, and especially with the COVID situation, avoid crowded places and only go to banks, when it is really essential. So the central bank is thinking quite positively and aggressively on it, that there is already an example. How can they now utilize, within Pakistan
Yeah.
as well? Yeah.
Or not even go to banks at all, right? I was thinking
Yeah.
about our discussion last night, and I was thinking through, it's been almost a year since the pandemic here in Washington, and I haven't stepped my foot into a bank in that 1 year. I've taken out cash from an ATM maybe 3 times.
Mm,
The rest of the transactions have all been digital, either through Apple Watch or iPhone, Apple Pay, or through a
mm,
card that's touchless,
mm,
because
mm,
no one's doing that anymore. So I think that COVID has accelerated that shift across the world. You mentioned NADRA, and I wanted to touch upon this as well, because a couple of guests that I've spoken to on this podcast last year mentioned one issue that they felt needed resolution, which was that NADRA had to start functioning more as a utility then as an institution that has to have a profit center. And their idea was that NADRA charges per transaction in terms of when you connect into its database and get information. How do you see NADRA's role in enabling the evolution of this system along with Raast in terms of making sure that the more evolved, more mature use cases in terms of credit history, collecting information of people, keeping it secure as well, and then also making sure that emerging fintech startups can build upon that layer of data to accelerate the evolution of the system? What role does NADRA play here?
Mm-hmm. So you see, we have interacted with NADRA as well, and I think somebody, I'm forgetting his name, but they gave a great example, and I actually believe that of using NADRA database as KYC. It's tricky. You see, NADRA is a passive database, uh, by which what I mean is that if I change my address, NADRA does not come after me and ask me what is your new address. Neither do they know, right? So they do not triangulate information and update information. So if anybody in my family is deceased or I am deceased, they are not going to fetch it from hospital that I'm deceased and they will update their database. So it's a passive database in that aspect. It is only as good as what information is updated in it. So the banking industry has to figure out that if that information with passive update is fine covering their risk. I think where NADRA sits on goldmine is that they have issued a unique number to everybody in the country who's a citizen. They have some credentials which are secret, which could be used to verify a customer, just like X factor authentication. So, it provides that kind of authentication model. And then the fact that, they have robust system. So if you want to connect your system with them and fetch biometric, for example, because they collected biometric as well, you could use that in your process. I personally believe, and many would disagree with me, I personally believe that even if you run this operation as a utility, there are costs of running such a utility. And the plea from NADRA has been that fine, if you want us to run a utility, somebody has to pay the build-up cost. If you expect us to also cuff up that capex and make it free for anybody to ping into our database and get a result out of it, we need uptime, we need servers, we need capacity. So if the banking industry wants this kind of service, they should pay for it. I think somebody has to pay for it. Even if the government decides to, fund this, or because, with the current infrastructure, NADRA's infrastructure is not suitable and not ready for massive, sessions, which are coming in and pinging and, trying to fetch information. The infrastructure will just sort of become busy and unavailable. So I think from that perspective, the banking industry has to figure out where do they want to use the verification, right? GSMA has created different models. There are other two-factor authentication models, which could be enabled. So I think sometimes, the whole sort of debate is masked under the rate that is provided by NADRA. Also, I think the banks make, I think, decent money on customers. So, they should be able to absorb. That is not the reason why I would, if I would be the investor, I would not invest because, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, when the cost of transaction was 50 rupee or very high, it may be the case, but now it has also come down. It is slab based. I don't think that's the issue.
And I think
And you could,
the fact that someone has to pay for it is important, right? I mean, that's the debate now that's turned in, taking more and more importance in India, for example, because they reduced the MDR to zero. which means that the stack itself has no inflow of profit coming in. So how do you scale that up in that situation has become a bigger and bigger question mark, because the adoption's gone up. You have to invest in servers, you have to upkeep, you have to provide customer service, etc. And I think that's what you're getting at as well, that if you expect NADRA to continue doing that somewhere or the other, there has to be a plan not only on capex, I would say, but on opex, and that opex has to grow over time, because this is only the beginning of the system itself.
Yeah, and I think a great example of that is how telecoms have targeted areas where it does not make business sense. So there is an entity called USF, it's a Universal Service Fund, and X% of revenue of telecom goes into that fund. And then that fund is used to deploy infrastructure, telecom infrastructure in areas, where there's no business sense. So there are methods many industries have adopted to kind of divide the load or divide the capex. There is no development fund in the financial industry in Pakistan. I think if the banks commit to that and partner with each other, and X% of their revenues go into a fund, which can then be utilized with common understanding and under rules and regulations, and with a common objective, one could distribute the burden. So I think that's where Pakistani financial market until recently few years have been stuck, waiting for a messiah to come and waiting for government to lead, and also agreed that there was work to be done on the regulation side as well. I think that's also something that was required. But now what we have in Pakistan is both SBP and SECP in their own domains when it comes to financial markets. We start to see a change. We've started to see a very progressive change. So, for example, SECP has started to roll out a number of initiatives, a number of regulations, P2P lending, for example, crowdfunding, for example, and they've also started a sandbox. So I think this kind of initiative was also missing from the two regulators, and we've started to see, now this also coming forward. Of course, what needs to be seen is, which entrepreneurs will take up the license, and what will they do with that? What kind of a company will they be able to create? Et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
So I think the ingredients are there. NADRA's infrastructure is also available. Cost is always a question, but then again, I don't know of any innovation globally which actually waited to happen, because the cost of transaction was 4 rupee. It's a negligible amount.
Yep.
I think investors would, even with a long-term view, would be able to even fund that in acquisition. I mean, there's so much acquisition cost that companies invest from their own side and recover it over the lifetime of the customer. So 4 rupee, for a transaction, I don't think that's a big showstopper.
I want to touch on some of the use cases for Raast itself, right? Obviously, it's just getting started. I want your perspective on 2-3 years from now. Like, what are some use cases that you think personally excite you about that the possibilities are there? For example, like I look at sitting in the United States, I look at something like an Affirm, which 3-4 years ago, you had to go through a credit check before you got a loan, a payments mechanism for purchasing a new Mac laptop, right? Or purchasing a new $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 consumer product. With Affirm now, you can in real time get approved and make payments over 4, 5, 6 months at a very good interest rate. And that is only possible because of innovation that has occurred in the back end side, right? In terms of being able to know who the consumer is, what their transaction history is, etc. So when you look at Raast and where it is today, obviously just getting started, 3 years from now, what type of use cases do you anticipate becoming the reality in Pakistan, and how do you see that shaping or changing Pakistan's not only consumer economy, but just commerce in general?
Okay. And to answer that question, allow me to build up
Sure.
with the point that what is Raast? So Raast in its core is a real-time clearing and settlement system. It's built on you know universally accepted principles which Gates Foundation researched quite a few years ago, and they call it level one principles. So what they have done is they've studied development of instant payment systems in many different countries, and they've studied what are the good practices, and they put together a kind of a a to-do list. And some of those principles actually suggest that any payment has to mimic cash. If it does not mimic cash, you build lack of trust and you build complexity. So it is an instant payment system. It's a push-based system, which basically means that when I transfer money to you, just like cash, if I hand over to you $10, you have it and I don't. The transaction is final. There's no reversal. There's no ambiguity. If you're not available, the transaction will not go through. If I don't have money, I can't, send you the money, etc., etc. And I think there's a big sort of there has to be a big appreciation of the fact that having a payment system which does this kind of transaction will lead to people's trust being improving on the system, that when I transfer money, it goes. It does not sort of go into some kind of limbo or suspense. And I don't know if it is, I still have it or do not have it, and have I sent it or not. It is a thin system, so it's based on its core, an account to account transfer, and over time it will build different products and services either itself or will partner with other sort of services. And that's where the central bank will figure out a model of how to include the private sector as well. So for example, the billers, the system does not have the ambition to aggregate the last mile, to aggregate the billers. The biller aggregation will be done by other entities, while for clearing and settlement, this system will be used. The other great sort of setup that the system provides is that it's also connected with the real-time gross settlement system, RTGS, which is an interbank settlement system, which basically means that all the banks are connected. So while the clearing is done, because the system is also connected with RTGS, so the settlement will also be done effortlessly. And it's a complete stack, which State Bank has now sort of provided. So it's a combination of both. There were some private switches out there, but the settlement was done through batches, so it was done T plus day. This system, because it's connected and housed within central bank, it has the ability to run multiple settlement batches within a day. And a great benefit for that would be to merchants. If you look at the merchant schemes, Visa, MasterCard, even other sort of schemes, you see that the smaller merchants actually get paid T plus one, T plus two, some cases even T plus three or four. We have been reported. So the merchant have to, and there's because they have received money digitally, they feel that they're being penalized, because now I have to invest from my working capital because I have to order my supplies the next day. You see, so there was a counter disincentive for merchants, smaller merchants, to use digital payments. And hence, if you go to Pakistan, so they would say कि आप cash दे दें या आप मेरे account में directly transfer कर दें. So they would not want to use their merchant account, because merchant account में payment जो है वो it lands after many days. So this system will have the ability to settle, many times a day. The decision has to be made still. UK, for example, the UK faster payment, a similar system settles 3 times a day. And if you make transaction all night, so in the 7 in the morning, you get the first settlement. At 11, you get the second settlement, and whatever business you do till 3 p.m., you get the third settlement, et cetera, et cetera. So it will move the liquidity faster. It will move the sort of money faster. And I think one of the benefits that we will get out of this is that the digital liquidity will increase. So people will then not be motivated or not be incentivized to cash out the digital sort of liquidity that has been created. And that's a big struggle in Pakistan because our original liquidity is cash. We need to convert that into digital. And, that requires some kind of motivation. I remember, in our previous sort of chat over email, you talked about demonetization that India has done, and
Yep.
does it require an exogenous shock like that or not? So, I mean, that's a separate discussion, but so that's the sort of issue that the country faces, and that's the kind of the business model that RAS also faces. So, in terms of the use cases, there are three use cases that at the heart this system will enable. It will enable a bulk, which basically means government paying its citizen. It could be welfare, it could be salaries, or any business wanting to push salaries or vendor payments or anything, etc., etc. That could be done through Raast. Then it also enables a simple account-to-account transfer, also known as P2P. Here, of course, one of the big issue is that if I want to do an honest transaction, for example, Easy Pesa to Easy Pesa, the experience is different. I can send money on a mobile number. But if there is an account that I'm sending, which is, for example, for that matter, Standard Chartered, the experience is altogether different. So a very dedicated customer will learn and understand. And then on top of it, each bank has its own alphanumeric kind of a magic number that they provide that I have to remember. So what the system RAS will do is it will provide a centralized directory. So an alias could be issued, just like PayPal, just like any other sort of centralized directory. And of course, initially it will not be a free form. I think uh, customers' maturity and in Pakistani context has to be sort of, we have to look at that context as well. And even if we start with mobile number, so imagine sending a payment to a mobile number, which is not just Easy Pesa connected with Easy Pesa account, but it's also connected with all other accounts. So it gives freedom to customers, and then it's the same experience, even if you do an honest transaction or an office transaction. The third thing, which we hope that the result will happen is that the interchange would be zero, MDR you talked about. Because this system has been developed through grant from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So it's kind of a no capex model for the industry. So they should sort of, use the hell out of it and load it with all kind of transactions. And unless, the system actually breaks down and depreciates, it's kind of free. So there, of course, will be operational cost, but hopefully, central bank and the banks will be able to absorb those costs, and it will be very, very nominal in my sort of understanding. And the third use case is the merchant use case. Paying to a merchant is a pain, and that's why merchants also prefer receiving cash or receiving money into their account because it helps them sort of avoid taxes. It also, if they use a merchant account, the payment, they actually receive payment from T+1 to T+5 in number of days. And then thirdly, we have had some uptake of QR code at merchant, but we see that that has kind of died down. And the reason is that it has added complexity both at the merchant side and the consumer side. So I think Pakistan may, and I've been a product manager as well, so I'm to blame as well, that we do a lot of copycat. We believe that because somebody else has done it, so I must do it. And the best innovation is to copy. So हम एक दूसरे को बड़ी जल्दी बंद गली में जो है ना वो बंद कर लेते हैं. So both on price competition as well as design. So without really understanding that what are the customer pain points and what are the merchant pain points, we launched QR code, and because it's not a superior experience, this is actually an experience which is worse than handing out cash or using a credit card. So very quickly, sort of, it has landed into problems. There have been discussions on interoperability of QR code, but true interoperability still has not been achieved. Um, the banks feel that if they acquire a merchant, it is theirs, and they want to make money on a closed loop, and that's where all of these issues Raast kind of busts, and hopefully central bank will come up with a merchant scheme which will be local, which will be universal, which will then promote, digital payments. There's already a scheme for local cards which have been launched called Payback. It's launched through one link. I think there's a decent uptake on it. But of course, we don't have enough POS machines in Pakistan to swipe the card. So hence, digital acceptance is very, very important. Also, Pakistan is a country where e-commerce is now started to increase. COVID has definitely pushed us into that direction. But a lot of people have figured out, a lot of entrepreneurs, women, youth have figured out that they could set up a business and serve customers, through e-commerce. So for them, it's also a big opportunity in times to come that a scheme, a merchant scheme, a payment acceptance scheme provided through Raast could be the enabler. So I think so from a payments perspective, it will provide the whole stack. What you refer to, the use case of credit and that kind of a thing. So the system has the capability. I think some of the other things have to fall in place for a credit decision to happen. Of course, the system should be filled with transactions. Only then the data is rich enough for credit analysis to be done. But how the system is designed, it will have the ability to connect with all in every entity. So we have credit bureaus in Pakistan, three, I think, and they've already shown desire to connect with such a system. And I think it will all depend on the players, how they decide how to develop each of this transaction. And I think, and there is a discussion, very hot discussion going on, that why has State Bank done this? And it should have been done by the private sector. And I think, yeah, private sector should have done it, but then they should have done it rather than talking about it.
Yeah.
The same goes with the fact that when you're developing these transactions, especially which require private sector engagement, will private sector step up, lead the innovation, figure out what needs to be done, what collaboration needs to be done, and do that? Or they will keep waiting for State Bank to actually slap them with, a regulation or something like this,
Yeah.
that, okay, here, go ahead and do this and do that. So for example, last year there was a ceiling which was provided on MDR because there was negative MDR cases. The market was so hung up on acquisition that if you go to a merchant, he had 10 machines. And one would sort of think that, why does he have 10 machines? Because one after the other, people wanted to steal the market share. So I think the private sector is to take the blame and the credit both for it. If they grow the market and if they don't grow the market, they have to direct their sales team, business development teams of where to focus and where not to focus. And I think if it is not utilized, I think the regulators now active in market development, so they will come up with their own design and they will enforce it. I wish to see a more partnership model where banks and other sort of fintechs feel that this is the system that they can use and rely on. And then, we are committed with State Bank to develop whatever is required, and there are many investors who may be ready to invest even,
Yeah.
thereon.
And I think that the rails are there now, right? So I think the first initial case, I hope just in 2021 alone, we will see the pension lines outside banks just go away. I think that would be a big success if you stop seeing those lines, because you have elderly people with coronavirus having to go every month collecting what is due from the government and standing in the heat or in the cold, and going through this very terrible customer service experience. You can just pay by Raast, and I think that goes away. So it's a huge thing. And then I think on the merchant side, the competition in terms of the financial services industry itself figuring out the fact that they don't need to chase after that same customer with 10 machines. The rails are there. Let's focus on value addition. Let's focus on customer experience and use cases, because that's the way to grow the entire market, right? And find new solutions to unmet needs. So one hopes that that continues to pick up. I think my most memorable experience was once when I was in India and I was out of cash, and go to a chai wala, and I have had the chai already, and he's like, money, and I'm like, oh crap, I forgot it in the hotel. He's like, you have a phone? I'm like, yeah. He's like, scan the QR code and just pay me by whatever Visa card that you have on your Apple. And I was like, wait, you can take that? And he's like, yeah, here's my QR code. It's interoperable. And I was like, wow, that's like a huge thing. And I asked him, like, do people use it a lot? He's like, all the time. Like, I don't use cash anymore because my accounting is now automated, because some startup sold him a service to do the accounting. My GST invoices are weekly. I know how much I need to pay through that accounting software. And all of a sudden, he was expecting he's going to expand his store, primarily because he had months of transactions data now to show that he was compliant, had a good business with a good revenue, and banks wanted to lend him money to open another shop. And that is phenomenal, right? At the bottom of the pyramid, you have this chaiwala who, by adopting a QR code and months down the road, sees his business expanding because of the rails provided by the government. And I hope that Raast is able to do that as well.
Inshallah, inshallah. No, totally agreed. I think it's a great example that you've quoted, and that's what the banks are supposed to do. The banking industry is supposed to be the backbone of the economics, and a sort of a great sort of indicator of that is how much credit, because you need leverage. So how much credit bank is offering consumer credit and retail credit and SME credit? It's negligible in Pakistan. So banks' contribution to formal economy or growing economy, no, that's very, very, very negligible. And yeah, I think it's a great innovation example that you've quoted, and hopefully Ras will be able to provide similar, if not same.
From your perspective, I know we're almost up with our time. Couple of final questions. What are some headwinds do you anticipate or risks that you see towards the adoption? I know we touched upon, like, for example, demonetization in India being the shot in the arm to, it was growing, but not as much. And then obviously demonetization happened. It's cost benefit analysis. We can spend hours debating, but the digital payments industry will say this was the shot in the arm that we needed to change the future of digital payments in the country. So what are some headwinds that you anticipate over the next few months in terms of adoption, and what would your recommendation be in terms of navigating those challenges?
So I think one big headwind is that the banks and the financial institutions who are going to be the biggest beneficiary, they keep on thinking that this is competition, and do not and use this infrastructure selectively, and do not use it aggressively. And there are many reasons why they would sort of not use it. You see, it's just like that village ka chalk. It can only get populated, if everybody sort of decides to go there. So State Bank has kind of given a moral persuasion that it is mandated for everybody to connect with Raast. And I think if it required, they will also provide a mandate, a circular as well, that you have to connect with this system. So some of the bigger institutions, they might find that they are better off by not opening up. That's a key debate which is happening because Raast provides the true interoperability. So they might feel that I want to keep my 5 million or 10 million customers to myself and not open up and not give them the opportunity. Uh, so that's one sort of issue: lack of investment by the banks, by the financial institutions, in terms of being their own challenger. And there's enough evidence that while some of the banks may be upgrading their infrastructures and even upgrading their core banking, et cetera, but do they really understand the meaning of digital experience? You know, and we see a lot of bad examples. Great products, bad experience, bad design. It leads to customer dissatisfaction. And even in the market where people want to utilize the service and they're tech savvy and they have the mobile phone and they have the experience and they have everything, they just sort of shy away because the experience is so bad.
And I
I
think
think
like
another headwind.
with money, sorry to interrupt here, but that's a very important point. Like with money, especially like if I buy something on Amazon or the Raz or whatever, and out of 10 transactions, one is bad, I still would go back because the customer service is there and there's a
Yeah,
return process. It's inconvenient, but I can still be like, okay, the net benefit is fine. But with money, you can do 100 great transactions, and if one transaction
yeah,
falls, does not go through or screws over, you're
yeah.
not going to trust that institution again for a long, long
No.
time because it's your money. People, it's a more
Yeah,
personal thing.
yeah. No, totally. I agree with that. And then you see, with this infrastructure, because it couples with other infrastructure. So the transaction that you were talking about that you did with the radiowala there, you had the phone. The phone had to be working. It needs to have internet. So the coverage that is provided for internet via mobile phone, the phone has to be affordable. So the technology infrastructure when it comes to connectivity also has to keep up. I think there was somebody who actually mentioned that if we start having transactions as we wish there could be, it might not choke the payment system, but it might choke the telecom network.
Yeah.
You see, so that system, that connectivity also has to keep up. Telecoms themselves are struggling with making a case for further investment. We see that the internet experience has been deteriorating. Ironic it is that the payment apps, the banking apps are still charged. I think the banking industry should come together and telecom industry should come together and at least make it zero rated. You know, because Pakistan has 95%, 98% prepaid market, and people keep very low balance in their account. It's a very low ARPU market, and so from all of those sort of factors have to sort of come together as well. I think a key decision still need to be taken, and time will tell. Will we have the push of financial inclusion and digital payments acceptance based on smartphone or on USSD? Smartphone penetration has definitely increased, but there's still a number of phones which require USSD input to access a mobile account because they're not smartphones. Will the banks do something? Will fintechs innovate in that space as well? So I think these are sort of dependencies of this system for it to really scale and achieve its potential. But I think if you look at what has been happening, and I think that's a great development. So central bank and SECP and even other sort of regulators have started to come together. I think that's what we saw in India. That's how you create a stack. Uh, I think what they need is, there was this thing in Pakistan last year. Chal gayi thi, there will be a CIO and there will be CIO of Pakistan, just like CIO of Estonia, and who will create the vision. And there'll be a digital Pakistan sort of vision, and what would that mean, etc., etc. We lost ground on that.
Mm-hmm.
I think you know the story. So whoever that sort of CIO of Pakistan is, I think it's a great way to put the country towards a vision. There has to be, of course, political sponsorship of such an agenda. लेकिन वो लैपटॉप देने से नहीं आएगा,
Mm-hmm.
वो नारे लगाने से भी नहीं आएगा, वो गरीबों में पैसे बांटने से भी नहीं आएगा. वो basically you have to get together different government departments, machineries, ministries together. A great example is the governor of State Bank. He leads a cross-functional effort every quarter. It's a meeting which has chairman from NADRA, chairman from PTA, FBR, you name it, and they are there. But then again, in a 4-hour long meeting, there's so much that you can, and the bank presidents as well, and the representatives. There's so much sort of you can do. So there has to be not a leadership meeting like this, but a functional,
Yep.
working groups between, let's say, taxation and payments, and I don't know, PTA, and then you figure out that okay, so we need to attack, let's say, KPK, and within KPK, how do we then cover Peshawar?
Yep.
And from digital payments. So what can municipal government do? What can local government do? What can provincial government do? What can federal government do? And that's how you divide different roles, etc., etc. So we have such examples, where, for example, in Punjab, PITV led this kind of a cross-department initiative in previous government. And I think they did an amazing job. So we need some of these change makers in the public sector as well, who could lead this effort. And there are examples, there are people, but I think they just need that mandate. And if we
Yeah.
have that mandate, it's a difficult thing to do, but I think that's the way to go.
And I think you have to be out of the box and innovative, right? So
Mm.
Raast was not there, but I remember last year having this conversation around coronavirus, that when at that time the fear was that the virus was, initial research suggested was traveling through surfaces, not through
Mm.
people's breath.
Mm.
This was before the mask mandates. And my thinking was that, one creative way that hits multiple targets in one policy measure was to make, at least for a short amount of time, and this can still be done now that Raast is there to increase adoption, just eliminate GST on digital transactions that go through the pipe. Why?
Mm.
Because you want, again, as you said, you need the motivation to go from cash into the digital ecosystem. The benefits of that are huge. So convincing the FBR to say, look, if you're willing to eat up some revenue for the next few months to catalyze the adoption of this thing, when the consumer comes in, has a great experience, the experience is sticky, they stay there. So if you incentivize, almost like acquiring a customer into the digital economy, you eat up some of the cost for that. And then you can, earn a lot more in GST, even with a lower rate, because the formalization is bigger, right? And I think those types of engagements across the board, and you don't have to do it nationally, as you said, do it in Peshawar, try something else in Lahore, try something else in Karachi, then discuss the lessons learned, and then move on from there. And I think in the private sector also, there's a need for that. You mentioned copycats and, the QR code, but maybe someone in the telecom sector, on the financial services sector in Pakistan, just needs to study Reliance Jio and JioMart across the border and see how
Mm.
they digitized everything, gave 4G experience, and built the entire commercial engine of the business on top of
Mm.
that, realizing that rather than competing in this dog eat dog world, if they go after the whole country and give them a mobile phone, they're their customer, and all of a sudden everything else follows from there.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. I agree. I think that's where we also fund a program which is called FinTech Disrupt Challenge, and we were just reviewing, what kind of headway we have made And we were like, why did we do this? And we said, okay, the disruption is something which is required in the market. And I totally agree. I think what the country requires is not incremental thinking, not incremental revenue, not incremental model. It requires a disruptive thinking. So we're hoping that, with this Raast coming and providing those sort of rails, now if anybody wants to think that about the business model, it will provide that necessary rails, and we hope to sort of. I'm wishing for a great sort of uptake of this system. It will be a disaster if the uptake is very very
No, I
slow.
think this is going to be a phenomenal success. I think there's a lot of unmet demand and need, particularly from younger people, to do
Hmm.
these transactions online and make it more convenient. So, wishing you all the best. This has been
Thank you.
phenomenal in terms of the work that you and the rest of the folks have already done. Before I let you go, what are two or three books that have deeply influenced you that you recommend listeners pick up and read?
I think there's one book that I think has really shaped up my thinking in last quite a few years, and I keep it as at my bedside as well, and I usually carry it around. That's The Tipping Point. I think it's very important if you are a change maker, and if you're part of any mission that requires change, it's very important to understand the dynamics of change and how change happens, and how do you bring sort of any mission, any movement to the stage where it reaches the tipping point, and then sort of it becomes sustainable, and it sort of finds its own way. So for me, tipping point is something maybe cliche, but every time that I've read that book, even the chapter that I read, it kind of gives me a new direction of how to analyze change, how to analyze the different aspects of change, and then how do you influence? Because the whole idea is to bring it to a tipping point, and then tip it over. And that's what we're trying to do.
No, that's a great book, and I think the points it makes are fantastic. I remember Nassim Taleb talking about the fact that to reach that tipping point mathematically, you need 5% conversion. You don't need the whole world to come after you. If you get 5% of people to adopt something new and unique, the rest will very quickly follow. It's just exponential from there. And if you like that book, I would recommend you check out Upstream. I'll email you the link to it because that talks about how do you go from day-to-day crisis management in certain issues where you're trying to change things and change is not happening. How do you go upstream in the problem and then fundamentally change? And again, I think those two books link together very nicely. So Rehan Saab,
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining us. Again, congratulations to you, your team, and everyone else in Pakistan who's worked on Raast. Really exciting initiative. Wishing you all the best and have a good rest of the evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on this podcast. Thank you. Thank you, sir.